There is a place on this earth so old, so incomprehensibly ancient, that the pyramids of Egypt look like something built last Tuesday by comparison. A place where the ground beneath your feet is not measured in centuries, not measured in millennia, but in billions of years. Billions. And yet most people have no idea it exists. They drive over it. They build cities on top of it. They ski on mountains that were once its floor. They swim in lakes that fill its craters. They live their entire lives above something that watched the first single-celled organisms learn to breathe, something that was already ancient before life had even figured out how to grow a spine. This place is the Canadian Shield, and what lies beneath it, what is buried inside it, what it has witnessed and preserved and hidden for 4 billion years, is one of the most extraordinary stories this planet has ever tried to tell. We tend to think of ancient in human terms. When someone says something is ancient, we picture Egyptian temples. We picture Roman roads. We picture cave paintings in France or stone circles in England. The oldest things we can really wrap our minds around are a few thousand years old at best. The pyramids at Giza were completed roughly 4,500 years ago. That number is staggering to most of us. We can barely imagine what the world looked like 4,500 years ago. But the Canadian Shield is not 4,500 years old. It is not 45,000 years old. It is not even 45 million years old. The rocks of the Canadian Shield, the deepest, most exposed, most studied rocks in that vast geological formation, have been dated to ages that approach 4 billion years. Some of them may be older. And the story of what that means, the story of what was buried there, what happened there, what lived there and died there and was crushed and heated and reformed there over nearly the entire span of Earth's existence, is a story that takes your breath away when you begin to truly understand it. The Canadian Shield is enormous. That is the first thing you need to understand about it. It covers approximately 8 million square kilometers, which makes it one of the largest geological shields on the planet. It stretches across most of northern and eastern Canada, from the Arctic in the north down to the Great Lakes in the south, from Labrador in the east all the way to the prairies in the west. It underlies all of Quebec, most of Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and significant portions of the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Labrador. Hudson Bay sits inside it like a massive crater punched into the middle of a continent. The Great Lakes sit at its southern edge, their basins carved by glaciers that use the shield's ancient rock as a foundation. Beneath the prairies, beneath the sedimentary rock that covers much of Western Canada, the shield is still there, buried deeper but present, the true bedrock of the continent. When geologists talk about the Canadian Shield, they are talking about a craton. That word craton comes from the Greek word for strength. A craton is a section of the Earth's crust that has been tectonically stable for an exceptionally long period of time. It is the opposite of a geologically active zone. It does not have active volcanoes. It does not have frequent earthquakes caused by tectonic plate collisions. It is, in geological terms, quiet, settled, ancient. The Laurentian craton, which is the technical name for the core of the Canadian Shield, is one of the oldest and most stable pieces of crust on the entire planet. The rocks that make it up have not been dramatically deformed, heated to extreme temperatures, or recycled back into the mantle for billions of years. They have simply sat there, enduring, surviving, preserving the record of a world that no longer exists in any other form. And what a record it is! To understand what is buried in the Canadian Shield, you have to understand something about how the Earth works. The planet is constantly consuming itself. The crust is divided into tectonic plates that move slowly across the surface, and where they collide, one plate typically dives beneath the other in a process called subduction. The subducting plate melts back into the mantle. The rock is destroyed. The history written in that rock is erased. This is why ancient rocks are so rare. The Earth eats its own history. Most of the ocean floor, for example, is no more than about 200 million years old, because the oceanic crust is constantly being recycled. Finding rocks that are more than 1 billion years old is genuinely unusual. Finding rocks that are 3 or 4 billion years old is extraordinarily rare, and yet the Canadian Shield is full of them. The reason the Shield has survived is precisely its stability. When the continent of North America was assembled over hundreds of millions of years, the craton formed its core. The tectonic forces that built mountain ranges, opened ocean basins, and drove volcanic eruptions happened at the edges of this core. The core itself remained largely intact, and because it remained intact, it preserved something priceless: the geological record of the early Earth. The rocks buried in the Canadian Shield are not merely rocks. They are time capsules. They are archives. They contain chemical and physical evidence of conditions on this planet that existed billions of years ago, conditions that cannot be found anywhere else in the rock record because everywhere else, those rocks have been destroyed. Let us start with the single most extraordinary geological find that the Canadian Shield has given us, because it sets the tone for everything else. In the remote northwest territories of Canada, along the Acasta River, there is an outcrop of rock that sits in a small cluster of islands in the middle of an unnamed lake. The landscape around it is classic Shield country: spruce trees, granite, muskeg, and sky. It looks like 10,000 other places in northern Canada. But this particular outcrop, which researchers began studying in the 1980s, is unlike any other place on the surface of the Earth. The rocks here, known as the Acasta gneiss, have been radiometrically dated to an age of 4.03 billion years. 4 billion years. When these rocks were forming, the moon was still fresh enough from its formation that its interior was still partially molten. There were no oceans as we understand them today. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere. Life had not yet begun, or if it had, it was so tenuous and primitive that it left no trace. The Acasta gneiss is a metamorphic rock, which means it was originally formed as something else, something older and then subjected to intense heat and pressure that changed its mineral structure. The original protolith, the rock that became the Acasta gneiss, may have been even older. When geologists dated the Acasta gneiss, they used a technique called uranium lead dating, which measures the ratio of radioactive uranium isotopes to the lead they decay into over time. The result was unambiguous. These rocks are 4 billion years old. They are the oldest known intact rocks on the surface of the Earth, and they are sitting in the middle of Canada, in a landscape that looks completely unremarkable from the outside, waiting for anyone curious enough to come and look. But here is where the story gets even more remarkable, because the Acasta gneiss, as extraordinary as it is, may not be the oldest thing buried in the Canadian Shield. About 1,500 kilometers to the east, on the eastern shore of Hudson Bay in northern Quebec, there is another outcrop of ancient rock that has been the subject of one of the most intense and controversial debates in the history of geology. This place is called the Nuvvuagittuq Greenstone Belt, and it sits near the community of Nuvvuagittuq on the eastern coast of Hudson Bay. The rocks here are different from the Acasta igneous. They are a type of volcanic rock called greenstone, dark green and dense, formed originally as lava flows on ancient seafloor. When researchers first studied these rocks, they got uranium-lead dates that put them in the range of 3.7 to 3.8 billion years old, which would already make them among the most ancient rocks on Earth. But then a second team of researchers applied a different dating technique, using the ratios of neodymium isotopes, and they got a date that caused an earthquake in the scientific community. Their analysis suggested the rocks of the Nuvvuagittuq belt could be as old as 4.28 billion years. 4.28 billion years. The Earth itself is only about 4.54 billion years old. If the Nuvvuagittuq dating is correct, these rocks formed within approximately 250 million years of the planet's birth. They formed during a period called the Hadean Eon, a time so violent and extreme that it was named after Hades, the Greek underworld. During the Hadean, the Earth was still being bombarded by asteroids and planetesimals left over from the formation of the solar system. The surface was partially molten. The atmosphere was thick with volcanic gases, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, but no oxygen. The oceans, if they existed at all, were young and potentially boiling. And yet, if the neodymium dates are correct, rocks formed during that hellish period are sitting on the surface in northern Quebec, accessible by float plane from a small indigenous community on the coast of Hudson Bay. The debate over the Nuvvuagittuq dates has not been fully resolved. Some geologists accept the neodymium dating. Others argue that the neodymium isotope ratios may reflect contamination or resetting events during later metamorphism, and that the actual age of the rocks is closer to the uranium lead dates of 3.7 to 3.8 billion years. But even the younger age is breathtaking, and the debate itself illustrates something important about what is buried in the Canadian Shield. There is so much of it that is still unknown, still being studied, still being argued over, that the Shield continues to surprise us. After decades of intensive geological research, after hundreds of expeditions and thousands of papers, the Shield is still giving up secrets. It is still revealing things that rewrite our understanding of the early Earth. The question is not whether it holds ancient mysteries. The question is how many. To truly appreciate what lies buried in the Canadian Shield, you need to understand what the world looked like when these rocks were forming. Let us go back 4 billion years and try to see the Earth as it was. There are no continents as we know them, not yet. The crust is thin and hot, perpetually fractured and remade by volcanic activity. The sky above is a toxic mix of gases, primarily water vapor, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, with traces of methane and ammonia. There is no ozone layer because there is no oxygen to form one, which means ultraviolet radiation from the sun bombards the surface unchecked. The sun itself is younger and dimmer, burning at only about 70% of its current luminosity. But despite the dimmer sun, the thick atmosphere traps heat, and the surface temperatures are warm, perhaps uncomfortably so. There are oceans. The geological and geochemical evidence increasingly suggests that liquid water existed on Earth by 4 billion years ago, possibly earlier. These early oceans are not blue and salt-rich like today's. They are warm, acidic, and rich in dissolved metals and minerals leached from the volcanic crust. And in these ancient oceans, something extraordinary may already be happening, because among the most stunning revelations that the Canadian Shield has produced, perhaps the most philosophically significant, is the evidence for ancient life. In 2017, a team of researchers led by Matthew Dodd published a paper in the journal Nature describing what they claimed were fossilized microbial structures in the rocks of the Nuvvuagittuq belt. These structures, tiny tubes and filaments made of iron oxide and carbonate, resembled the fossilized remains of iron oxidizing bacteria that live near hydrothermal vents on the modern ocean floor. If the structures are genuinely biological in origin, and if the rocks containing them are as old as the neodymium dating suggests, then the Nuvvuagittuq belt contains evidence of life that is 4.28 billion years old. That would push back the origin of life on Earth by nearly 1 billion years compared to what was previously accepted, and would mean that life began almost as soon as the planet was cool enough to support it. The implications of that possibility are staggering. If life on Earth began that quickly after the planet formed, it suggests that the origin of life is not a vanishingly rare event requiring hundreds of millions of years of exactly right conditions. It suggests that life is almost an inevitable consequence of having liquid water and the right chemistry, which means that life might be everywhere, which means that the ancient rocks buried in the Canadian Shield may not just be the oldest things in Canada or the oldest things in North America. They may be our first window into the question that has haunted humanity since we first looked up at the stars and asked whether we were alone. Of course, the claim has been contested. Other researchers have argued that the tube and filament structures in the Nuvvuagittuq rocks could be explained by purely chemical processes, that they do not necessarily require a biological origin. This is the nature of science at the frontier. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence from rocks that may be 4 billion years old is always going to be ambiguous, because 4 billion years is a very long time for delicate biological structures to survive. The original living organisms, if they existed, left only the most ghostly impressions in the rock. But the debate is ongoing, and the Canadian Shield remains at its center because the rocks are there, accessible, waiting for better techniques and better instruments and more researchers to come and study them. Let us move from the oldest rocks to something equally fascinating, the ancient geography that the Canadian Shield preserves. When we look at the Shield today, we see a landscape that has been profoundly shaped by glaciation. The last great ice sheets retreated from Canada only about 10,000 years ago, and they scoured the Shield clean, stripping away soil and loose material and exposing the bare rock beneath. They carved thousands of lakes into the rock. They deposited vast fields of glacial debris across the southern margins. They pressed the crust down with their weight so thoroughly that it is still rebounding today, a process called isostatic rebound, where the land slowly rises now that the ice is gone, like a mattress recovering after a heavy sleeper has rolled off. But beneath the glacial landscape, beneath the lakes and the muskeg and the boreal forest, the Shield preserves the ghost of something even more ancient. It preserves the roots of mountains. 3 or 4 billion years ago, the region that is now the Canadian Shield was not a flat, eroded plain. It was, in at least some places, a zone of intense tectonic activity, with volcanic arcs and colliding crustal blocks and the roots of mountain ranges that may have been as tall as anything on Earth today. The rocks we see at the surface of the Shield, those ancient gneisses and greenstones, were not formed at the surface. They were formed deep underground, miles below the surface, where heat and pressure were intense enough to melt and recrystallize rock. They are at the surface now because billions of years of erosion removed everything above them. The mountains that once towered above the rocks of the Shield are gone so completely that not a pebble of them remains. They eroded away, and their sediments were deposited in ancient seas, and then those sediments were themselves metamorphosed or subducted or eroded away in turn. What we see when we look at the Canadian Shield is not the surface of an ancient landscape. We are looking at the basement of an ancient world. This idea that the shield preserves the deepest roots of ancient mountain ranges is one of the most intellectually dizzying things about it. Think about the Himalayas. They are tall, dramatic, visually spectacular mountains. But what you see above the snow line is only a fraction of what those mountains really are. Below ground, the Himalayas have deep roots, crustal material that extends down into the upper mantle. Those roots are hot and under enormous pressure. And now imagine that the Himalayas erode away over the next 3 billion years. The mountains themselves disappear. The rivers carry their material to the sea. But the deepest roots, the most compressed and metamorphosed material from miles underground, remains. And eventually, after enough time passes and enough erosion occurs, those roots are at the surface. That is essentially what you are looking at when you look at the granite outcrops of the Canadian Shield. You're looking at the deepest roots of mountains that no longer exist, mountains that were old before the first fish swam in any sea. The Canadian Shield is divided by geologists into several distinct provinces, each of which represents a different piece of the ancient puzzle. The Superior Province, which covers much of northern Ontario and Quebec and is the largest Archean craton on Earth, contains some of the best preserved and most studied ancient rocks on the planet. The Slave Province in the Northwest Territories contains the Acasta gneiss, the Trans-Hudson Origin, a geological zone that runs from Hudson Bay down through Manitoba and Saskatchewan, represents the scar of an ancient collision. The Suture Zone, where 2 or more ancient crustal blocks were welded together between roughly 1.8 and 1.9 billion years ago. That collision, the Trans-Hudson Orogeny, was one of the defining events in the formation of the Canadian Shield as we know it. It was, in its time, a collision on the scale of the modern collision between India and Asia that is building the Himalayas, and the mountains it built were enormous. But they are gone now, reduced to those deep crustal roots that crop out across the shield today. Within the Superior Province, one of the most remarkable geological terrains is the Abitibi Greenstone Belt, which straddles the Ontario-Quebec border and represents one of the largest and best preserved sequences of Archean volcanic and sedimentary rock in the world. The Abitibi Belt formed roughly 2.7 billion years ago, during a period of intense volcanic activity that built a series of volcanic arcs and ocean basins across what is now the Shield. The rocks of the Abitibi Belt include ancient lavas, ancient volcanic ash deposits, ancient sediments deposited in shallow seas and river systems, and ancient hydrothermal deposits, places where superheated water rich in dissolved metals vented through the seafloor and deposited those metals as the water cooled. Those hydrothermal deposits are the reason northern Ontario and Quebec became one of the world's great mining regions. The gold and copper and zinc and silver that made towns like Timmins and Kirkland Lake and Val-d'Or famous are Archean in age, deposited by hydrothermal activity 2.7 billion years ago, sitting in the rock for nearly 3 billion years before humans arrived to dig them out. The Archean eon, which lasted from 4 billion years ago to 2.5 billion years ago, is the period that produced most of the oldest rocks in the Canadian Shield. But after the Archean came the Proterozoic, and the Proterozoic brought its own extraordinary events to the Shield. The Proterozoic eon, which lasted from 2.5 billion years ago to 540 million years ago, was a period of profound transformation for the Earth. It was during the Proterozoic that oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere for the first time, a catastrophic event for the anaerobic organisms that had dominated life up to that point, and a transformative one for the planet as a whole. It was during the Proterozoic that complex single-celled organisms evolved, and it was during the Proterozoic that the first supercontinent, Nuna, also called Columbia, assembled and then broke apart, with significant consequences for the structure of the Canadian Shield. The evidence for Proterozoic events in the Canadian Shield is buried everywhere you look, if you know what to look for. The Sudbury Basin in northern Ontario, for example, is one of the most extraordinary features in the Shield, and it is the result of an impact event that occurred 1.85 billion years ago. The Sudbury Basin is the scar left by an asteroid or comet that struck the Earth with unimaginable force. The impactor is estimated to have been between 10 and 15 kilometers in diameter, and when it hit the surface, it vaporized rock, melted the crust to a depth of tens of kilometers, and created a basin roughly 60 kilometers in diameter that filled with molten rock and gradually crystallized. The crater, eroded and deformed over nearly 2 billion years of geological history, is not immediately obvious in the landscape, but the geological signature of the impact is unmistakable. The rocks of the Sudbury Basin include a layer called the Sudbury Breccia, an enormous sheet of shattered and melted rock that was thrown out across hundreds of kilometers by the impact. And buried within the basin, crystallized from the melt sheet, are some of the world's largest deposits of nickel, copper, cobalt, and platinum group metals. These metals exist at Sudbury because the impactor itself was rich in them, and when it vaporized and mixed with the melted crustal rock, it distributed its metallic payload through the melt sheet. Billions of years later, those metals are still there, being mined by one of the largest mining operations in the world. But Sudbury, remarkable as it is not the most dramatic impact structure in the Canadian Shield. That distinction belongs to the Manicouagan Reservoir in Quebec, which is one of the most visually striking geological features in North America when viewed from space. The Manicouagan impact structure is roughly 100 kilometers in diameter, and the circular lake that fills its erosional remnants is so large and so perfectly circular that astronauts on the International Space Station have called it one of the most recognizable features on Earth's surface. The Manicouagan impact occurred 215 million years ago, during the late Triassic period, which makes it much younger than the Sudbury impact. But it is still one of the best preserved large impact craters on Earth, and it gives a visceral sense of the scale of violence that has periodically punctuated the history of the Canadian Shield. The Canadian Shield has been struck by asteroids and comets many times over its 4 billion year history. The surface bears the scars of at least 30 confirmed impact structures, and there are probably many more that have been erased by erosion or buried under younger rock. Each impact was a cataclysm. The largest ones, like Sudbury, would have had global effects, injecting enormous quantities of rock vapor and dust into the atmosphere, causing climate disruption on a planetary scale. And yet, the Shield endured. It absorbed these blows as it absorbed everything else: the mountain building, the glaciations, the erosion, the slow grinding passage of nearly 4 billion years, and it preserved the record of them in its rocks, waiting for the day when a species of upright walking primates would develop the tools and the curiosity to read it. One of the most fascinating buried features of the Canadian Shield is something that cannot be seen at all from the surface: the ancient topography that lies beneath Hudson Bay. Hudson Bay, the enormous inland sea that sits at the geographic heart of the Shield, is relatively shallow, with an average depth of about 100 meters, and it floods a vast basin in the center of the craton. But Hudson Bay has not always been a sea. Its history is far more complex and interesting than its current existence as a shallow marine basin would suggest. The bedrock beneath Hudson Bay is ancient Archean and Proterozoic shield rock. Before the bay was flooded, when the continental ice sheets had depressed the land so thoroughly that it sat below sea level, and even before that, when sea level itself was different, the Hudson Bay Basin had a very different character. It contained rivers, lakes, and terrestrial environments. The sediments on the floor of Hudson Bay include material deposited in these non-marine environments, mixed with marine sediments from the periods when the bay was flooded, and below those sediments, the basement rock of the bay records events that happened billions of years ago. The Hudson Bay Lowlands region, which forms the southwestern coast of Hudson Bay, is underlain by Paleozoic sedimentary rocks that were deposited in shallow seas between roughly 500 and 300 million years ago. But go deeper, drill through those sedimentary layers, and you reach the ancient shield basement, the same Archean and Proterozoic rock that crops out all around the bay. The boundary between the sedimentary cover and the ancient basement is one of the most important geological contacts in North America, a surface that represents an enormous gap in time, hundreds of millions of years during which the shield surface was exposed and eroding while the rest of the world went through the Cambrian explosion of life, the colonization of land by plants and animals, and the rise and fall of multiple ocean basins. The Hudson Bay Basin itself, the sedimentary basin that fills the center of the shield, contains another mystery. Beneath the Paleozoic sedimentary rocks, but above the ancient basement, some researchers have found evidence of what may be a very ancient sedimentary basin, one that formed during the Proterozoic, when the region looked very different from today. The details of this ancient basin, if it exists, are still being worked out from seismic data and deep drill cores. But the possibility that beneath Hudson Bay, buried under layers of younger sediment and more than 100 meters of seawater, there is an ancient Proterozoic basin preserving the record of a world that existed 1 billion or more years ago, is exactly the kind of hidden complexity that makes the Canadian Shield so endlessly fascinating to those who study it. Let us turn now to one of the most controversial and exciting aspects of ancient Canadian geology, something that challenges our understanding of when complex life began on this planet. The Gunflint Chert, which outcrops along the north shore of Lake Superior in Ontario and extends into Minnesota, is a Proterozoic sedimentary rock that was deposited approximately 1.87 billion years ago. The Gunflint Chert was known as an iron-bearing rock formation, useful for starting fires, which is why early European settlers and Indigenous peoples valued it. But in 1954, a geologist named Stanley Tyler began a systematic study of the Gunflint Chert and made a discovery that would eventually revolutionize our understanding of the history of life. Tyler found, preserved in the chert, microfossils, exquisitely preserved, three-dimensional, clearly biological structures, filaments, spheres, star-shaped forms, and other shapes that could only have been produced by living organisms. The Gunflint microfossils were the oldest confirmed fossils known at the time of their discovery, and they push back the known record of life by more than 1 billion years compared to what had previously been accepted. They demonstrated that complex microbial communities with multiple distinct forms of organisms, existed nearly 2 billion years ago. And they revealed something extraordinary about those communities. The Gunflint organisms were not simple, featureless blobs. They had distinct morphologies. Some of them showed evidence of cell walls and internal structures. Some of them formed chains and colonies. These were highly evolved microorganisms, creatures that had been through billions of years of evolution already at the time these rocks were being deposited. The simplest of them looked more complex than anything that a person unfamiliar with microbiology might expect from a rock nearly 2 billion years old. The gunflint microfossils have been studied by researchers for decades and have yielded a remarkable amount of information about the chemistry and biology of the Proterozoic world. The organisms they represent include early cyanobacteria, the ancestors of the photosynthetic microbes that would eventually produce most of the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. The presence of cyanobacteria in the gunflint chert nearly 2 billion years ago is consistent with the timing of the Great Oxidation event, the period between about 2.4 and 2.1 billion years ago, when atmospheric oxygen began to rise significantly for the first time, permanently transforming the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere and making possible the evolution of oxygen-breathing life. The story of the Great Oxidation event and the Canadian Shield is one of the most intimate in Earth history. The shield rocks themselves preserve the chemical evidence of this transformation. In the ancient Archean rocks of the shield, iron is present in mineral forms that indicate the original sediments were deposited in an environment with very little or no dissolved oxygen. In the later Proterozoic rocks, iron appears in forms that indicate the presence of oxygen. The transition from one chemical regime to the other, preserved in the rocks of the shield, is the chemical fingerprint of the moment when cyanobacteria began producing enough oxygen through photosynthesis to overwhelm the oxygen sinks in the oceans and begin accumulating it in the atmosphere. It is one of the most important moments in the history of life on Earth, preserved in the ancient rocks buried in and exposed by the Canadian Shield. The banded iron formations of the shield deserve special attention here, because they are among the most visually striking and geologically significant rocks in the formation. Banded iron formations, or BIFs, as geologists call them, are layered sedimentary rocks composed of alternating bands of iron-rich minerals, primarily magnetite and hematite, and silica-rich minerals, primarily chert. They are typically red and gray in color, with thin alternating bands that give them a striped appearance. They are found across the Canadian Shield in enormous quantities, particularly in the Mesabi Iron Range of Minnesota and the Atikokan area of Ontario. And they formed in a very specific way that is intimately connected to the chemistry of the ancient oceans and the evolution of photosynthetic life. In the early Archean oceans, iron was abundant in dissolved form. Without oxygen to oxidize it, iron could stay dissolved in seawater. But when cyanobacteria began producing oxygen through photosynthesis, even in tiny quantities, the dissolved iron reacted with the oxygen and precipitated out of solution as iron oxide. This iron oxide sank to the seafloor and was buried. During periods of high photosynthetic activity, iron-poor, silica-rich layers were deposited. During periods of lower oxygen production, iron accumulated in solution again, and then precipitated in another iron-rich layer. The result was the alternating bands of iron-rich and silica-rich rock that make up the banded iron formations. Banded iron formations were deposited worldwide between about 3.8 and 1.8 billion years ago, and then deposition essentially stopped. The reason they stopped forming is believed to be that, by about 1.8 billion years ago, there was enough oxygen in the oceans to have oxidized virtually all of the dissolved iron, leaving the oceans iron depleted. The banded iron formations are therefore a chemical record of the transition from an iron-rich, oxygen-poor ocean to the oxygenated ocean we have today. And some of the largest and best preserved sequences of banded iron formation in the world are buried in and exposed across the Canadian Shield. The economic significance of these ancient chemical processes for Canada cannot be overstated. The enormous iron ore deposits of the Mesabi Range, which supplied the raw material for American steel production throughout the 20th century, are banded iron formations deposited billions of years ago in the ancient sea that covered the region that is now the Great Lakes. The gold deposits of the Abitibi Belt were deposited by hydrothermal systems operating at the bottom of an ancient Archean ocean. The nickel and copper at Sudbury were brought there by an asteroid impact nearly 2 billion years ago. The diamonds found in kimberlite pipes across the Northwest Territories formed in the Earth's mantle at depths of more than 150 kilometers and were then blasted to the surface by volcanic eruptions. Hundreds of millions of years ago, eruptions that penetrated through the stable cratonic crust of the shield because the lithosphere there was thick and old and had a particular relationship with the underlying mantle that made it a favorable location for kimberlite emplacement. Canada is one of the world's leading diamond producers today, and the diamonds come out of the ancient rock of the Canadian Shield. They are crystals of carbon that formed in the deep mantle beneath the shield, carried to the surface by processes set in motion by the same extraordinary geological heritage that makes the shield what it is. But let us return to the question of life, because that is where the most philosophically significant story of the Canadian Shield is being told right now. Beyond the gunflint microfossils, beyond the possible Nuvvuagittuq biosignatures, there is a growing body of evidence that the Canadian Shield has been hosting life for an astonishingly long time, and that some of the most significant biological innovations in the history of Earth took place in the environments preserved in these rocks. The transition from prokaryotic life, simple cells without a nucleus, to eukaryotic life, cells with a true nucleus and complex internal structures, is one of the most important events in the history of biology. Eukaryotic cells are the building blocks of all complex multicellular life, including plants, animals, and fungi. Every cell in your body is a eukaryotic cell, and the earliest definitive evidence for eukaryotic life comes from rocks of Proterozoic age, from a time span when the Canadian Shield was accumulating sedimentary sequences and preserving biological material with extraordinary fidelity. The shale units of the Proterozoic sequences in the Shield, some dating to 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, have yielded what are interpreted as the oldest known eukaryotic fossils, structures called acritarchs, which are thought to represent the cysts or outer walls of early eukaryotic plankton. These tiny organic walled structures, visible only under a microscope, are found preserved in ancient black shales in the Shield region, and they represent the evolutionary precursors of all complex life that followed. The appearance of eukaryotes in the fossil record is a pivotal moment, because eukaryotic cells can become much more complex than prokaryotic cells. They can develop specialized internal organelles. They can reproduce sexually and generate genetic variation more efficiently, and they can become the components of multicellular organisms. The roots of the tree of complex life are buried in the Canadian Shield. One of the most extraordinary things about studying the ancient geology of the Canadian Shield is the way it reveals how different the Earth's geography was for most of its history. We are accustomed to thinking of the world's continents as essentially fixed features, modified somewhat by tectonic drift, but recognizably similar to what they have always been. But the reality is that the continents have been in constant motion for the entire history of the Earth, assembling into supercontinents and then breaking apart again in cycles that take hundreds of millions of years to complete. The oldest supercontinent for which we have reasonably good evidence is Nuna, also called Columbia, which assembled roughly 1.8 to 1.5 billion years ago and then broke apart. Before Nuna, there may have been even older supercontinents reconstructed with less certainty from the paleomagnetic and geological evidence preserved in the Shield rocks. The Canadian Shield was a core component of Nuna. The Trans-Hudson origin, the ancient collision zone that runs through Manitoba and Saskatchewan, represents the suture where two or more ancient cratons were welded together during the assembly of Nuna. The rocks of this zone record a continental collision that would have been at least as dramatic as the modern collision of India with Asia. There would have been mountain ranges comparable to the Himalayas, rising across what is now the flat interior of Canada. There would have been deep ocean trenches being subducted. There would have been volcanic arcs and back arc basins and all the other features that characterize a modern collisional zone. And then, over hundreds of millions of years, all of that drama was eroded away, and the plains of Manitoba and Saskatchewan were laid down across the flat, stable remnant of the collision zone. But the deep roots are still there. The basement beneath the prairies preserves the evidence of a collision that happened nearly 2 billion years ago. After Nuna came Rodinia, which assembled roughly 1 billion years ago and broke apart somewhere between 750 and 600 million years ago. Rodinia's breakup was associated with an extraordinary climatic event that has left its own marks on the geological record, the snowball Earth events. Between roughly 750 and 580 million years ago, the Earth experienced at least 2 and possibly more episodes of extreme glaciation, during which the entire planet may have been covered in ice from pole to equator. These are the snowball Earth events, and their cause is believed to be connected to the breakup of Rodinia and the resulting changes in the configuration of the continents. The geological evidence for snowball Earth comes from glacial deposits found at tropical latitudes in rocks of the appropriate age, and the Canadian Shield preserves some of that evidence. Ancient glacial deposits, tillites, are found in the Proterozoic rock record of the Shield, and some of them have paleomagnetic signatures that suggest they were deposited at low latitudes, consistent with a global glaciation. The snowball Earth events were arguably the most extreme climate events in Earth's history. If the entire planet was indeed frozen over, the consequences for life would have been catastrophic. The photosynthetic productivity of the oceans would have been dramatically reduced. Many species would have gone extinct, but life survived, perhaps sheltered around volcanic but hydrothermal vents in the oceans or in liquid water beneath the ice. And after each snowball Earth event, when volcanic CO2 from ongoing eruptions gradually built up in the atmosphere to the point where it overcame the reflectivity of the ice and caused a runaway greenhouse warming, the thaw was equally extreme. The climate swung from global ice to extreme greenhouse conditions in what was geologically a very short time, and the chemical disruptions this caused in the oceans and atmosphere may have been a major driver of the rapid evolutionary diversification that followed. The Ediacaran period, which came after the last snowball Earth event and immediately preceded the Cambrian explosion of animal life, saw the first complex multicellular organisms appear in the fossil record, and the Canadian Shield, by preserving the record of those extreme glaciations and their aftermath, helps us understand the environmental pressures that shape the evolution of complex life. The relationship between the Canadian Shield and the Indigenous peoples of Canada is as deep and as long as the Shield itself allows. The first humans to enter Canada came across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia somewhere between 15,000 and possibly much earlier, and they spread across the continent, including across the enormous territory of the Shield. The Shield environment, with its thin soils, cold climate, abundant lakes and rivers, and dense boreal forest, shaped the cultures and technologies of the peoples who lived there. The Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Algonquin, and many other indigenous peoples have lived in the Shield country for thousands of years, and their relationships with the land are inseparable from its geological character. The Shield's lakes and rivers provided the highways of travel and the sources of food. The shield's granite outcrops became the canvases for pictographs, the red ochre images that mark sacred places along lake shores across the Canadian Shield and represent one of the oldest artistic traditions in North America. The Ojibwe rock paintings at Agawa Rock in Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario, the Mishabiju paintings at Agawa, are among the most famous, but they represent thousands of such sites distributed across the Shield. These paintings are typically located at places where the rock face rises directly from the water, at transitional zones between the human world and the world beneath the surface, the world of the Manitus, the spiritual beings that inhabit the landscape according to Anishinaabe cosmology. The choice of these locations was not arbitrary. They are geologically significant places, places where the ancient rock is visible and dramatic, places where the Shield makes itself felt most powerfully. The relationship between indigenous spiritual geography and the actual ancient geography of the Shield is something that deserves much more study and attention than it has received. The geological significance of the Shield also shaped the economics of European colonization in ways that still define Canadian society. The Shield's rivers were the routes by which fur traders, first Indigenous and then European, moved furs from the interior to the coast. The Shield's forests provided the lumber that built colonial settlements. The Shield's fish-filled lakes and rivers fed generations of people. But most consequentially, for the development of Canada as a modern nation, the Shield's ancient rocks contain the mineral wealth that would eventually make Canada one of the world's leading mining nations. The discovery of silver at Cobalt, Ontario in 1903, triggered one of the great mining rushes in North American history. The discovery of gold in the Abitibi Belt made Timmins and Kirkland Lake famous around the world. The nickel at Sudbury, the uranium at Elliott Lake, the copper and zinc across the Shield, all of these are the products of processes that operated billions of years ago. Processes set in motion in the ancient oceans and volcanic systems and hydrothermal vents of the Archean and Proterozoic Earth, preserved in the rocks, discovered by miners and prospectors who often had no idea of the extraordinary rich antiquity of what they were pulling out of the ground. The uranium deposits of the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan are particularly worth discussing in the context of the ancient Shield, because they represent one of the most extraordinary concentrations of economic mineral wealth on Earth and are directly tied to ancient geological events. The Athabasca Basin is a Proterozoic sedimentary basin that was deposited between about 1.7 and 1.5 billion years ago on top of older Archean basement. At the contact between the younger sedimentary rocks of the Athabasca Basin and the older Archean basement, hydrothermal fluids circulating through the rocks deposited enormous quantities of uranium minerals, creating what are known as unconformity-type uranium deposits. These are the highest-grade uranium deposits in the world. The uranium deposits at McArthur River and Cigar Lake in Saskatchewan have grades of uranium ore that are hundreds of times higher than the global average for uranium mines. They are sitting at the ancient unconformity, the geological boundary surface that marks the contact between the Archean basement and the Proterozoic basin, preserved by geological processes that operated between 1 and 2 billion years ago. The Athabasca Basin uranium deposits are a reminder that the Shield is not just ancient. It is ancient in ways that matter for human civilization right now. The uranium mined from the Athabasca Basin fuels nuclear power plants around the world. The nickel from Sudbury goes into stainless steel and into the batteries that power electric vehicles. The gold from the Abitibi Belt circulates through the global financial system. The diamonds from the Northwest Territories are in jewelry stores on every continent. The Shield is not just a geological curiosity. It is a living, productive part of the global economy, and everything valuable that comes out of it is the product of processes that operated billions of years ago, in conditions that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. There is another buried feature of the Canadian Shield that geologists have been investigating with increasing interest in recent decades: the ancient mountain range known as the Grenville Province, and what it reveals about the assembly of Rodinia. The Grenville Province is a belt of ancient mountain-building rocks that runs along the southeastern margin of the Canadian Shield, from Labrador in the northeast through Quebec and Ontario and into the United States. It represents the roots of a mountain range that was built between roughly 1.3 and 1 billion years ago during the assembly of the supercontinent Rodinia. The Grenville orogeny, as this mountain building event is called, was one of the defining events of the late Proterozoic Earth, and the mountains it built are believed to have been enormous, perhaps comparable to the modern Himalayas. They are long gone. The peaks that once stood miles above the surface have been reduced to nothing by billions of years of erosion. But the deep roots, the intensely metamorphosed basement rocks of the Grenville Province, are there at the surface of the shield, recording the temperatures and pressures of rocks that were once buried tens of kilometers underground. The Grenville Province is also important because of what it tells us about the connection between North America and other continents during the assembly of Rodinia. The geological signatures of the Grenville Province match up with similar aged mountain belts in other continents that were once part of Rodinia: the Sveka-Norwegian Belt in Scandinavia, the Namaqualand Belt in southern Africa, the Musgrave Block in Australia. All of these geological features are the same age as the Grenville Province and share similar rock types and geological histories. They are the scattered remnants of a single mountain range that was built along the interior of Rodinia when multiple crustal blocks collided. By matching up these remnants and working out the geometry of the collision, geologists can reconstruct the ancient supercontinent, and the Canadian Shield is one of the key reference points for this reconstruction because the Grenville Province preserves such a clear and well-exposed record of the Grenville orogeny. Deep beneath the eastern shield, buried under kilometers of younger sedimentary and metamorphic rock, there may be even older features. The deep seismic reflection surveys conducted across various parts of the shield have revealed unexpected structures in the middle and lower crust that do not correspond to anything visible at the surface. Some of these features appear to be ancient suture zones or thrust faults from collision events that predate the currently recognized major orogenies. Some appear to be the remnants of ancient volcanic or intrusive complexes that never reached the surface. The deep crust of the shield is largely inaccessible, known only from the indirect evidence of seismic waves, drill cores from the deepest boreholes, and the occasional tectonic uplift that has brought lower crustal material to the surface. But what is known suggests that the complexity we see at the surface of the shield is only a hint of the complexity that extends downward through the crust. The lithospheric mantle beneath the Canadian Shield is itself one of the most extraordinary features of the planet. The mantle beneath a craton is different from the mantle beneath younger, thinner crust. The cratonic lithospheric mantle is cold and chemically depleted, having had its easily melted components extracted by the volcanic processes that built the craton billions of years ago. It is also thick, extending down to depths of 200 to 300 kilometers or more, compared to perhaps 100 kilometers beneath oceanic crust. This thick, cold, chemically distinctive mantle root acts as a keel beneath the craton, stabilizing it against the convective motions of the deeper mantle and contributing to its long-term tectonic stability. Without this mantle keel, the cratonic crust would likely have been disrupted and recycled long ago. The mantle keel beneath the Canadian Shield is one of the reasons the ancient rocks of the Shield have survived for 4 billion years, when the rocks of almost everywhere else on Earth have been destroyed and reprocessed, and it is in this deep mantle keel that the diamonds of the Canadian Shield formed. Diamonds require extremely high pressures and temperatures to form, conditions that exist only in the upper mantle at depths of more than 150 kilometers. Beneath the thick cratonic mantle keel of the Shield, those conditions are met. Carbon in the mantle, whether from subducted organic material or from the primordial carbon that was part of the Earth's original composition, crystallizes as diamond under those extreme conditions. The diamonds can then remain trapped in the mantle for hundreds of millions or even billions of years. They are brought to the surface only by a very specific type of volcanic eruption called a kimberlite eruption, in which volatile rich magma from great depth rises rapidly to the surface in a narrow pipe, carrying diamonds and other mantle minerals with it. The speed of the ascent is crucial. If the diamonds rise too slowly, the decrease in pressure allows them to convert to graphite. Kimberlite eruptions happen fast, and the result is a narrow carrot-shaped body of rock called a kimberlite pipe, containing within it a sampling of the deep mantle, including, if the conditions are right, gem-quality diamonds. The Northwest Territories of Canada, particularly the Lac de Gras area northeast of Yellowknife, turned out to contain one of the world's great concentrations of diamondiferous kimberlite pipes. The discovery of diamonds in the Northwest Territories in the early 1990s was one of the most significant mineral discoveries in Canadian history, and it transformed the economy of the region. The Ekati mine, which opened in 1998, was Canada's first diamond mine. The Diavik mine opened in 2003. Together with other mines in the region, they made Canada one of the top diamond-producing nations in the world. And the diamonds they produce are ancient. Not as ancient as the kimberlite pipes themselves, which are mostly Cretaceous in age, meaning the eruptions that brought the diamonds to the surface happened roughly 100 to 150 million years ago. But the diamonds themselves, the actual crystals, are far older. Diamonds have been dated from worldwide localities at ages ranging from hundreds of millions to more than 3 billion years old, and there is every reason to believe that the diamonds brought to the surface by Canadian kimberlites include some that formed in the deep mantle beneath the Canadian Shield billions of years ago during the same early chapters of Earth history, recorded in the ancient surface rocks of the Shield. One of the most thrilling recent developments in the study of the ancient Canadian Shield has come not from drilling or mapping or radiometric dating, but from a completely unexpected direction: the discovery of living microorganisms deep within the ancient rocks of the Shield. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Barbara Sherwood Lawler at the University of Toronto published a paper in the journal Nature, describing the discovery of water in fractures in Precambrian rocks at the Kidd Creek mine in Timmins, Ontario, the deepest base metal mine in the world. The water was very deep underground, found in fractures in rocks at depths of between 2.4 and 3 kilometers below the surface. When the researchers analyzed the chemistry of this water, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. The water was ancient. Isotopic analyses indicated that it had been isolated from the hydrological cycle, cut off from interaction with surface water, for somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 billion years. The water in those deep fractures had been there since the Proterozoic, and then they analyzed the gases dissolved in the water, and they found hydrogen, methane, and other hydrocarbons. Not only that, but they found sulfate that had been chemically altered in ways consistent with biological activity. The implication was staggering. in fractures in ancient Precambrian rock, cut off from the surface for 1 billion years or more, there might be living microorganisms sustained by the chemical energy in the hydrogen produced by the reaction of water with ancient minerals. The reaction in question is called serpentinization, in which iron-bearing minerals react with water to produce hydrogen and various iron oxides. The hydrogen can then serve as an energy source for microorganisms that use a form of metabolism called chemolithotrophy, getting energy from chemical reactions rather than from sunlight. Subsequent work by Sherwood Lawler's group and others has found similar ancient fracture waters in other mines in the Canadian Shield, and the case for deep microbial life has grown stronger. The Canadian Shield, that ancient tectonically stable block of rock that has been sitting there for billions of years, contains within its deep fractures a hidden biosphere. A community of microorganisms that has been living in the dark, sustained by ancient chemistry, isolated from the surface world for timescales that dwarf all of human history. These organisms, if they exist in the numbers and distributions currently suggested, are not just scientifically fascinating curiosities. They represent a potentially, important component of the global carbon cycle, and may be analogous to the microbial communities that could exist in subsurface habitats on other planets and moons. Mars has ancient rocks that may have fracture systems similar to those in the Canadian Shield. Europa and Enceladus have liquid water in contact with rocky material. The discovery of deep life in the Canadian Shield makes the possibility of life in these extraterrestrial environments more credible and more worthy of investigation. The sheer scale of what is buried in and preserved by the Canadian Shield continues to expand with each new study and expedition. Geophysical surveys of the Shield using gravity measurements and magnetic anomalies have revealed structures buried deep beneath the surface that have no surface expression at all. Some of these buried structures are what geologists call crypto-explosion structures, possible ancient impact craters that have been completely buried by younger rock or sediment and are known only from the geophysical signatures of the disturbed and shocked rock beneath the surface. The Canadian Shield may contain dozens or hundreds of ancient impact structures that have never been confirmed because the rocks that would reveal them are inaccessible. Each of those potential structures represents a cataclysm in the deep past, a moment when something from space struck the earth and changed it, and the record of that moment is preserved in the rocks, waiting. The sedimentary rocks that cover parts of the Shield, particularly the Paleozoic sediments of the Hudson Bay lowlands and the St. Lawrence lowlands, add another layer of complexity to the buried history. These younger sedimentary rocks, deposited between roughly 500 and 300 million years ago, when shallow tropical seas covered parts of the Shield margin, contain their own fossil record. The Ordovician and Silurian limestones of the Niagara Escarpment, the Devonian Reef limestones of Manitoba, the Cambrian sandstones of the Ottawa Valley, all of these preserve evidence of the explosion of animal life that followed the Precambrian era. Trilobites, corals, crinoids, brachiopods, early fish, the first vascular plants, the Paleozoic fossil record of Canada is rich and varied, and it sits unconformably on top of the ancient Shield basement, separated from it by an enormous gap of time. To stand in a Paleozoic limestone quarry in Ontario and look at the fossils of Ordovician sea creatures, and then to look at the granite outcrops nearby and contemplate the 4 billion years of history in those rocks, is to experience geology as something genuinely profound. The Sudbury Basin deserves a deeper examination because it is not just an impact structure. It is a window into some of the most extreme geological processes that have operated on the Canadian Shield. The Sudbury impact, occurring 1.85 billion years ago, was not just large. It was unique in the particular way it interacted with the existing geology. The impactor struck a region of the shield that already had a complex geological history, a region where the trans-Hudson origin had recently sutured together ancient crustal blocks, and where the crust was being intruded by large granite and gabbro bodies. The impact melted this pre-existing rock and created a melt sheet of extraordinary volume, estimated at several thousand cubic kilometers. As this melt sheet cooled and crystallized, it differentiated. The heavier minerals sank. The sulfide minerals, which were the main carriers of the economically important metals like nickel and copper, sank to the bottom of the melt sheet and crystallized as the footwall mineralization and the contact mineralization that is mined today. But the impact also created something unexpected. It may have triggered a period of hydrothermal activity that lasted millions of years. The heat from the cooling melt sheet drove hydrothermal fluids through the surrounding rock, and some of those fluids carried additional metals. The hydrothermal systems at Sudbury created some of the highest grade ore deposits in the basin, and they also created something of great scientific interest: reaction zones where hot fluids interacted with the shocked and shattered rocks of the impact structure, creating unusual mineral assemblages that include shocked quartz, coesite, and other high-pressure minerals that can only form under impact conditions. These minerals are unambiguous markers of a large impact event and have been used to identify Sudbury as an impact structure and to study the conditions in the impact. The story of how scientists came to understand that Sudbury was an impact structure is itself a fascinating piece of scientific history. For most of the 20th century, the Sudbury Basin was interpreted as a volcanic feature, a large intrusion of mafic magma that crystallized to form the distinctive circular shape of the basin. The igneous rocks at Sudbury, the Sudbury Igneous Complex, were seen as a large differentiated intrusion, but anomalies kept accumulating. The rock types didn't quite match what would be expected from a purely volcanic intrusion. The structures in the country, rocks around the basin, including shatter cones and shocked quartz, were not typical of volcanic systems. Eventually, in the 1960s and 1970s, as impact geology developed as a scientific discipline largely in response to the Apollo moon landings, the evidence for an impact origin for Sudbury became overwhelming. Today, it is universally accepted that the Sudbury Basin formed by the impact of a large extraterrestrial body, making it one of the oldest confirmed impact structures on Earth, and certainly one of the most economically significant. Now let us consider something that is perhaps the most intellectually arresting aspect of the ancient Canadian Shield, something that tends to get lost in the discussion of minerals and ages and geological processes. What the Shield tells us about the impermanence of everything. When you hold a piece of Acasta gneiss in your hand, a rock 4 billion years old, you're holding something that was formed when the Earth itself was less than 500 million years old. In those 4 billion years, the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs came and went. Every species of plant and animal that has ever lived on this planet evolved, lived its span, and went extinct. Every mountain range that existed when those rocks formed has been completely destroyed by erosion. Every ocean basin that existed when those rocks formed has been consumed by subduction. The entire biological evolution of life on Earth, from the first uncertain chemical steps towards self-replication, through the origin of the first cell, through the invention of photosynthesis and the oxygenation of the atmosphere, through the evolution of the nucleus and the mitochondrion, through the first multicellular organisms and the Cambrian explosion of animal life, through the colonization of land, through the age of fish and the age of amphibians, and the age of reptiles, and the age of dinosaurs, and the age of mammals, and the evolution of our own species. All of that happened while those rocks were just sitting there, unchanged, holding the memory of a world so different from our own that we can barely reconstruct it. The impermanence cuts both ways. Everything that seemed permanent and eternal has changed or disappeared. The mountains are gone. The oceans have moved. The continents are in different places. The atmosphere has a completely different chemical composition. The organisms that lived have been replaced by others, and yet the rocks endure. The Akasta gneiss is still there. The Nuvvuagittuq greenstone is still there. The gunflint chert is still there. The banded iron formations are still there. In a world defined by change, the ancient rocks of the Canadian Shield represent something almost paradoxical: the persistence of the past in the midst of universal transformation. That persistence is what makes the Canadian Shield so valuable scientifically. Most of Earth's history has been erased. The tectonic conveyor belt has shredded and recycled most of the rock that ever formed on this planet. The deep time of Earth's history, the first 4 billion years, is accessible to us only through the windows that ancient stable terrains like the Canadian Shield provide. And those windows are narrow. The information preserved in the Shield is precious precisely because it is rare, the only surviving record of a world that otherwise exists only in theoretical models and computer simulations. One of the most active areas of research in Shield geology right now is the investigation of what happened during the Archean, that first great eon of Earth's geological history from 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago. The Archean Earth was profoundly different from the modern Earth, and understanding those differences is critical for understanding how the planet evolved into its current state. One of the most fundamental questions is whether plate tectonics operated during the Archean at all. Modern plate tectonics, the system of moving lithospheric plates, subducting oceanic crust, and building continental crust through volcanic arcs, is the defining process of modern Earth geology. But the Archean Earth was hotter, with more internal heat from the decay of radioactive elements and from the residual heat of planetary formation. A hotter mantle would have behaved differently from the modern mantle, and the style of tectonics might have been fundamentally different. Some researchers argue that Archean tectonics was dominated by a process called vertical tectonics, or sagduction, in which dense volcanic material sank downward into the underlying crust rather than moving laterally, as in modern plate tectonics. Others argue that something resembling modern plate tectonics operated as early as 4 billion years ago, citing the tectonic structures visible in the oldest rocks of the Shield. The rocks of the Superior Province, particularly the Abitibi Greenstone Belt, preserve structures that look remarkably similar to modern volcanic arcs and ocean basins, suggesting that some form of horizontal plate motion was operating. But the scale and style may have been different from the modern system. The debate is unresolved, and the rocks of the Canadian Shield are at the center of it, because they are the primary observational data against which models of Archean tectonics must be tested. The mafic intrusions that penetrate the Archean rocks of the Shield are another window into the Archean mantle. Great dike swarms, sheets of dark igneous rock injected into fractures in the ancient basement, are found across the Shield in multiple generations, each representing a different episode of extension or magmatism. The Mackenzie Dike Swarm, for example, radiates outward across the Shield from a point in the Northwest Territories in a fan-like pattern that covers an area thousands of kilometers across. It was intruded about 1.27 billion years ago during a period of rifting that preceded the breakup of the supercontinent Nuna. The dikes are mafic in composition, made of gabbro and diabase, and they represent pulses of hot mantle material that welled up from below when the crust was stretched and fractured. They cut through rocks that are already 1 billion or more years older than themselves, and they have been there ever since. Dark lines of intrusive rock, cutting across the pale granites of the shield surface, visible in aerial photographs and satellite images as straight, dark lines extending for hundreds of kilometers. The paleomagnetic properties of these dike swarms are among the most important constraints we have on the ancient geography of the Canadian Shield and its place in Precambrian supercontinents. When mafic magma crystallizes, the magnetic minerals in it align with Earth's magnetic field at the time of cooling, preserving a record of the direction and intensity of the ancient magnetic field. From this record, geologists can calculate where the rock was located, relative to the magnetic poles when it crystallized, and by comparing the paleomagnetic records of dike swarms and other Precambrian rocks from different continents, they can work out how those continents were positioned relative to each other in the distant past. The Mackenzie dikes and other dike swarms of the Canadian Shield have been extensively studied for their paleomagnetic properties, and the data from them is a key input into reconstructions of the Proterozoic supercontinents. The late Proterozoic history of the Shield, from about 1 billion to 540 million years ago, is a period of particular interest because it immediately precedes the Cambrian explosion, the rapid diversification of animal life that produced most of the major body plans of modern animals within a geologically short time. The causes of the Cambrian explosion are still debated, and the environmental conditions that preceded it are an important part of that debate. The Neoproterozoic, as this latest Proterozoic interval is called, was a time of extreme environmental instability with the snowball Earth glaciations, dramatic changes in ocean chemistry, and significant evolutionary innovations. The Canadian Shield's rock record of this period is not as complete as some other parts of the world, because the glaciations of both the snowball Earth events and the much more recent Pleistocene glaciations have eroded much of the Neoproterozoic sedimentary record, but what remains is informative. In the Mackenzie Mountains of the Northwest Territories, at the western margin of the Shield, Neoproterozoic sedimentary sequences are preserved that record some of the most important events of that turbulent period, including glacial deposits believed to represent snowball Earth conditions, and the chemical changes in the ocean that accompanied the end of glaciation. These rocks have yielded some of the oldest known fossils of complex, multicellular organisms in North America, including trace fossils, the tracks and burrows of ancient organisms that represent the first definitive evidence of animal behavior in the geological record. The transition from a world without animals to a world with them is recorded in these rocks, and that transition is one of the most consequential events in the history of life on this planet. Let us also consider the glacial history of the Shield, not just the Proterozoic snowball Earth glaciations, but the much more recent Pleistocene glaciations that have shaped the surface landscape so dramatically. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from about 2.6 million years ago to about 11,700 years ago, was characterized by a series of glacial and interglacial cycles, during which enormous ice sheets repeatedly advanced over and retreated from the northern continents. The Canadian Shield was the nucleus of the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacial system that covered much of North America during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago. The ice sheet was centered over the Shield, and it grew outward from there, eventually covering an area of more than 13 million square kilometers and reaching thicknesses of 3 to 4 kilometers over the Shield itself. The weight of this ice depressed the Earth's crust by hundreds of meters, and as we mentioned earlier, the crust is still rebounding from that depression today. The Laurentide ice sheet was not just a passive covering of ice. It was a powerful geological agent. It eroded the surface of the shield, stripping away ancient soils and unconsolidated material and leaving behind the bare rock landscape that characterizes so much of the shield today. It carved lakes, thousands and thousands of them, into the granite and gneiss of the shield surface, creating the lake country that defines the geography of northern Ontario and Quebec, and that has been so important to Indigenous cultures and to Canadian identity. It transported boulders, some of them enormous, hundreds of kilometers from their sources, depositing them as erratics in landscapes where the underlying rock is completely different. These glacial erratics are themselves a geological resource, because by tracing them back to their sources, geologists can reconstruct the flow patterns of the ancient ice sheet. The erosion by the Laurentide ice sheet has had a profound effect on the accessibility of the shield's geological record. By stripping away the soil and loose material, the ice exposed the ancient bedrock, making it accessible for study. The shield country of northern Ontario, with its polished rock surfaces, its roches moutonnées, its drumlins and eskers and other glacial landforms, is a landscape that the ice sheet laid bare for geological inspection. The eskers, those long sinuous ridges of sorted sand and gravel deposited by meltwater rivers flowing beneath the ice, snake across the shield surface for hundreds of kilometers in some places, and they are important features not just geologically, but ecologically, providing well-drained habitats in an otherwise boggy landscape and serving as travel corridors for wildlife and for Indigenous peoples. The retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet created another extraordinary feature of the shield landscape, the Great Proglacial lakes. As the ice retreated northward, meltwater ponded against the retreating ice front and the landscape that had been depressed by the ice. Lake Agassiz, the largest proglacial lake in North American history, covered an area estimated at more than 1 million square kilometers at its maximum extent, larger than any lake on Earth today. It covered much of Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and parts of the United States. Lake Agassiz existed for roughly 4,000 years, from about 11,000 to 7,000 years ago, before its waters drained through various outlets into the ocean. Its floor became the flat, fertile ground of the Manitoba and Saskatchewan prairies and the lake bed clays of the Red River Valley. But its margins, the beaches and deltas and shore terraces that surrounded it, are still visible in the landscape of the shield and the adjacent plains, carved into ancient rock or deposited as sand and gravel beaches that now sit dozens of meters above any modern lake. The catastrophic drainage events of Lake Agassiz and other proglacial lakes have been connected by some researchers to significant disruptions in global climate. When enormous volumes of cold, fresh meltwater were released into the North Atlantic from these proglacial lakes, the sudden influx of fresh water disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the system of ocean currents driven by differences in temperature and salinity that transfers heat from the tropics to the high latitudes. The disruption of this circulation system is believed to have caused temporary episodes of cooling, including the Younger Dryas event, roughly 12,000 to 11,700 years ago, a sudden cold snap that interrupted the warming trend following the end of the last glaciation and caused major environmental and cultural changes for the people who were then colonizing North America. The shield, by holding and then catastrophically releasing the meltwater of the retreating ice sheet, thus played a role in the climate history of the planet, right up to the threshold of written human history. The lakes themselves left behind after the Proglacial lakes drained and the smaller glacial lakes settled into the carved rock basins of the shield are themselves extraordinary features. The Great Lakes, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior, are the largest group of freshwater lakes in the world by total area, containing about 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Their basins were carved by the advancing Laurentide ice sheet into rock of the shield and its margin, following pre-existing river valleys and zones of weaker rock. Lake Superior, the largest of the Great Lakes by surface area, sits in a basin carved partly into the ancient Precambrian rocks of the shield and partly into the slightly younger mid-continent rift system, a zone of failed continental rifting that formed about 1.1 billion years ago when the North American continent began to split apart. The rift never fully opened to form a new ocean, but it left behind enormous volumes of mafic volcanic rock and associated sedimentary basins that now form the rocks along the shores of Lake Superior, including the spectacular red sandstones of the Pictured Rocks, National Lakeshore, and the basalt flows of the Keweenaw Peninsula. The mid-continent rift system is itself one of the most geologically significant buried features associated with the Canadian Shield. It extends from Kansas northward through Lake Superior and then curves back toward the east through Michigan and Ohio. The failed rift represents an episode of extension and volcanic activity that began about 1.1 billion years ago during the early stages of the breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia and lasted for roughly 20 million years before stopping. During that time, enormous volumes of mafic lava poured out of fissures in the crust, building up sequences of basalt flows kilometers thick. The copper deposits of the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan are native copper that was deposited in the vesicles of these ancient basalt flows by hydrothermal fluids circulating through the rocks, and they were mined by indigenous peoples thousands of years before European contact. The copper tools and ornaments made from Keweenaw copper have been found in archaeological sites across eastern North America, evidence of trade networks that connected the Shield country to communities hundreds of kilometers away. It is remarkable to consider the depth of human relationship with the ancient materials of the Canadian Shield. Long before anyone understood the geology of the rocks they were using, indigenous peoples were mining copper from ancient volcanic rocks, napping chert and quartzite from ancient sedimentary formations, using ochre derived from ancient banded iron formations to create the pigments for rock paintings and body decoration, and fishing in lakes carved by ancient glaciers into 4-billion-year-old granite. The deep time of the Shield was always there, always present, always shaping the possibilities of human life in that landscape, even before it was understood or named. The story of how the Canadian Shield came to be understood by Western science is itself a fascinating historical narrative. The systematic geological mapping of the Shield began in earnest in the 19th century, as the Geological Survey of Canada, founded in 1842, began the enormous task of mapping the geology of British North America. The early surveys were conducted under extraordinarily difficult conditions, traveling by canoe and on foot through roadless country, mapping rock formations that extended for thousands of kilometers in all directions. The geologists of the Geological Survey, men like William Logan, whose name is honored in the Lake Logan of the Trans-Hudson origin, and George Mercer Dawson, who mapped much of Western Canada, including the Shield country of the prairies, were among the first scientists to systematically document the extent and complexity of what lay beneath Canada. William Logan, the first director of the Geological Survey of Canada, made an observation in the mid-19th century that was profoundly significant. He recognized that the crystalline rocks that underlie most of the Canadian Shield are older than any fossiliferous sedimentary rocks, and that they represent a period of Earth history before the appearance of complex life. Logan called this ancient basement the Laurentian gneiss, and his recognition of its antiquity predated by decades the development of radiometric dating that would eventually put precise numbers on its age. Logan could not know that the rocks he was mapping were 4 billion years old. He only knew that they were very old, older than anything that had been systematically studied before, and he was right in a way that would not be fully appreciated until the 20th century. The development of radiometric dating in the early 20th century transformed our understanding of the shield's antiquity. Before radiometric dating, geologists estimated the age of rocks from their relative position in the stratigraphic sequence, and from qualitative arguments about rates of erosion and sedimentation. These estimates were wildly variable and often drastically underestimated the actual ages involved. When Ernest Rutherford and others developed the principles of radioactive decay and applied them to geological materials, and when Arthur Holmes produced the first geological timescale based on radiometric dates in 1913, the deep time of the Earth began to come into focus. The first measurements of shield rocks gave ages of hundreds of millions of years. As techniques improved, the ages grew longer. By the mid-20th century, ages of 1 and 2 billion years were being measured for shield rocks. And then in 1989, when Samuel Boring and his colleagues published the first precise uranium-lead dates for the Akasta gneiss, the extreme antiquity of the shield was definitively established. 4 billion years. The number was not just scientifically significant, it was philosophically transformative. Understanding the age of the shield is one thing. Understanding what it means is another, and that is a task that scientists, philosophers, writers, and ordinary curious people are still working on. The age of the Akasta gneiss puts it in the context of a universe that is 13.8 billion years old. The Earth itself is about 4.54 billion years old. The Akasta gneiss formed about 500 million years after the Earth itself formed. In the great span of cosmic time, the Earth is not young. It is a middle-aged planet. And the Canadian Shield contains rocks from almost the entire span of Earth. History, from the earliest Archean through the Proterozoic and into the Phanerozoic, all the way up to the Pleistocene glacial deposits and the Holocene soils and lake sediments that are forming right now. This completeness, or near completeness, of the rock record in the Shield is part of what makes it such a valuable archive. Other parts of the world have older or younger rock records, but few have the temporal breadth of the Canadian Shield. From 4 billion years ago to 10,000 years ago, from the Hadean Archean boundary to the end of the last ice age, the Shield has been recording events, preserving evidence, accumulating the physical memory of a planet in continuous transformation. What lies buried in the Shield is not just rocks, it is time itself, made solid and accessible. The future of Shield geology is bright, and it is being driven by new technologies and new questions. Advances in mass spectrometry have made it possible to date minerals with greater precision and from smaller samples than ever before. Single crystal analyses of individual minerals within a rock can now give ages with uncertainties of a few million years or less, even for rocks that are 4 billion years old. This precision allows geologists to reconstruct the detailed history of complex rocks that were formed, metamorphosed, and then metamorphosed again multiple times over billions of years. The Shield, with its long and complex history of geological events, is a natural laboratory for these new techniques. Advances in geophysical imaging are revealing the deep structure of the Shield with unprecedented clarity. Modern seismic arrays using networks of seismometers that record both artificial blasts and natural earthquakes can produce three-dimensional images of the crust and upper mantle beneath the Shield. These images reveal the suture zones and ancient faults and buried basin margins that define the Shield's architecture at depth. They reveal the geometry of the mantle, keel beneath the craton, showing how it thickens toward the center and thins toward the margins. And in some places, they reveal unexpected structures that do not fit the current models, prompting new questions and new studies. The deep earth beneath the Canadian Shield is not yet fully mapped. There are still surprises waiting to be found. The geochemistry of shield rocks continues to yield new insights into the early Earth. Stable isotope studies of oxygen and sulfur in ancient minerals are revealing the chemistry of the Archean oceans and atmosphere with increasing precision. The oxygen isotope compositions of ancient zircon crystals, those tiny, extraordinarily durable minerals that survive even the most intense metamorphism and preserve their uranium-lead ages through billions of years of geological processing, are being used to constrain the temperatures and compositions of the earliest oceans. The emerging picture is one of an Archean Earth that had liquid water from very early on, that had a carbon cycle and a water cycle, and possibly even something resembling the modern style of plate tectonics, but operating in conditions very different from today. The search for life in the ancient rocks of the Shield continues with new techniques and new enthusiasm. The detection of chemical biosignatures in rocks. This old requires extraordinary care to distinguish biological signals from purely chemical ones, and the development of new analytical techniques that can detect and characterize organic molecules and isotopic fractionations at the parts per billion level is opening new doors. If life began on Earth very early, as the Nuvvuagittuq evidence suggests it might have, then the Shield's ancient rocks may contain far more biological information than has yet been extracted from them. The search for those signatures is ongoing, and the deep biosphere work at Kidd Creek and other Shield mines continues to reveal the extent and diversity of microbial life in the ancient fractured rock. New drilling programs aimed at reaching the deepest parts of the Shield crust are being planned, with the goal of accessing fluids and rock from depths of 5 or 10 kilometers, depths where the pressures and temperatures are more extreme and where the microbial communities, if they exist, may be even more isolated and unusual than those found so far. The possibility that the deep Canadian Shield hosts a microbial ecosystem that has been evolving in isolation for hundreds of millions of years is one of the most extraordinary concepts in modern biology. There is something almost poetic about the fact that the same geological stability that has preserved the ancient rocks of the Shield for billions of years has also, in the Shield's deep fractures, preserved pockets of ancient water and possibly ancient life. The stability of the craton is not just a geological fact. It is a preservational gift. It is the reason we can still read the earliest pages of Earth's story. It is the reason that 4-billion-year-old rocks are sitting at the surface of northern Canada, available to anyone with the curiosity and the resources to go and look at them. In a world that is constantly destroying and recreating itself, the Canadian Shield has simply endured, holding its secrets, waiting. The vastness of the Shield, more than 8 million square kilometers, means that even after more than a century of geological mapping and study, large portions of it remain poorly known. Remote sensing and satellite geology have allowed geologists to map the surface characteristics of the Shield from orbit, but there is no substitute for the ground truth of direct examination. Huge areas of the Shield, particularly in Nunavut, the Northwest Territories and northern Quebec, and Labrador, are accessible only by aircraft, and extended field seasons in those regions are expensive and logistically challenging. Many rock units in those remote areas have never been systematically sampled or dated. Many geophysical anomalies have never been ground truthed by drilling or surface mapping. The Shield continues to offer opportunities for fundamental discovery that would be impossible in more accessible and thoroughly studied parts of the world. The stories that the Canadian Shield tells are stories about the very deepest nature of this planet. They are stories about how the Earth began, how it differentiated from a molten ball of rock into a planet with continents and oceans and an atmosphere. They are stories about how life began, the most fundamental question in all of biology, the question that connects us to everything else that lives on this planet and to the possibility of life elsewhere in the cosmos. They are stories about how the chemistry of the Earth changed over time, how the atmosphere was transformed by the metabolic activities of microorganisms so completely that the world became habitable for complex life. They are stories about collision and catastrophe, about asteroids and glaciers and volcanic eruptions and the slow grinding of tectonic plates. And they are stories about persistence, about the extraordinary fact that the oldest things on Earth are still here, still accessible, still telling their stories to anyone willing to learn to read the language of rock. When the explorer David Thompson traveled through the Shield Country in the late 18th century, he marveled at the ancient rock and the vast emptiness of the landscape. He had no way of knowing, of course, that the rocks he was walking over were 4 billion years old. He had no concept of deep time in the geological sense. He could not have imagined that the bare granite he was portaging across had been there, unchanging, since before the first fish swam in any sea. But he felt the ancientness of it. He felt the weight of the silence and the age of the rock. It is a feeling that anyone who has spent time in the Shield Country knows. There is something about the Shield landscape, the bare rock, the cold, clear lakes, the silence that communicates ancientness in a way that bypasses intellectual understanding and goes directly to some older part of the mind. That feeling is not irrational. It is a response to genuine antiquity. The Shield is old in a way that the brain struggles to process intellectually, but that the body somehow recognizes. Standing on 4 billion-year-old rock and looking at a landscape that has not changed substantially since the last ice age, in a place where the nearest road might be hundreds of kilometers away, there is a sense of time that is qualitatively different from anything experienced in a city or a town. It is the feeling that you are in the presence of something that has witnessed the entire span of life on Earth, something that was ancient when the first trilobite crawled across a Cambrian seafloor, something that has survived everything the planet has thrown at it and will be there long after we are gone. That is the Canadian Shield. It is the most extraordinary piece of real estate on Earth, not for its economic value, though that is considerable, not for its scenic beauty, though that is genuine and profound, but for what it contains and what it has preserved. Buried within it, accessible in its exposed rock faces and deep mines and remote outcrops, is the story of the first 4 billion years of this planet's history. The story of the early Earth, the story of the origin of life, the story of the great oxidation event, the story of ancient supercontinents and mountain ranges and ocean basins, the story of the deep biosphere, the story of an impacted, glaciated, mineralized living world. A world so old that the pyramids of Egypt, those great monuments to human ambition and ingenuity, are less than an eye blink in comparison. A world buried just beneath the surface of Canada, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be read, waiting to tell its story to anyone willing to listen. The next expedition to the Acosta River region will find the same rocks that have been there for 4 billion years. The next drill core from the deep mines of the Canadian Shield may bring up ancient water that has not seen the surface since before the dinosaurs existed. The next satellite image of the Manicouagan crater will show the same perfect circle that formed when an asteroid struck the Shield 215 million years ago. The next analysis of a fragment of Nuvvuagittuq greenstone may settle the question of whether life began on Earth 4.25 billion years ago or a bit later. The Shield will be there for all of it, unchanged, patient, ancient beyond measure, holding its secrets, and slowly, stone by stone, releasing them to those with the curiosity and the tools to ask the right questions. Something ancient is buried beneath the Canadian Shield. Many things are. the oldest rocks on Earth, the oldest possible fossils, ancient oceans and ancient mountains and ancient impact craters and ancient life, ancient water that has been locked in fractures since before complex life existed, ancient diamonds formed in the mantle when dinosaurs had not yet evolved, ancient chemical signatures of the very first photosynthesis and the very first oxygenation of the atmosphere, ancient memories of a planet that looked nothing like the one we know, preserved in stone, waiting in silence beneath the lakes and forests of Canada, older than the pyramids, older than the oldest human story, older than the oldest tree, older than the oldest ocean, older, almost, than the planet itself. That is what lies buried beneath the Canadian Shield, and we have barely begun to read it. Consider for a moment the concept of a geological unconformity, because it is one of the most important concepts for understanding the Canadian Shield, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives outside of geology classrooms. An unconformity is a contact between two rock units that represents a gap in time, a period during which rock was eroded rather than deposited, or during which deposition simply did not occur. The most famous unconformity in geological history is Hutton's unconformity at Siccar Point in Scotland, where James Hutton in 1788 first grasped the concept of deep time by recognizing that the tilted lower rock unit and the horizontal upper rock unit represented an enormous gap in geological history, a gap so long that Hutton famously declared he could see no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. But the unconformities of the Canadian Shield make Hutton's discovery look almost trivial by comparison. The Great Unconformity, a surface found across North America where Cambrian sedimentary rocks sit directly on Precambrian basement, represents a gap in the rock record of roughly 500 million years. At the base of the Cambrian sedimentary sequence in the Ottawa Valley, you can put your hand on a surface where the rock beneath your palm is more than 1 billion years old, and the rock immediately above your palm is about 500 million years old. 500 million years of Earth history, erased by erosion, missing from the record, represented only by a flat, polished surface in the rock. These unconformities are not just scientific curiosities, they are the silences in Earth's autobiography. They represent chapters that have been torn out and destroyed, periods of Earth history that we can only guess at from indirect evidence. The Canadian Shield, because of its enormous extent and its long history of exposure to erosion, has more of these unconformities than almost any other region on Earth. Each one represents a gap in the record, a mystery. What happened during those missing intervals? What did the surface look like? What organisms lived and died? What climates prevailed? What geological events occurred that left no trace because the rocks that recorded them were removed? We do not know, and in most cases we will never know. The erosion was too thorough, the time too long. The Shield keeps its deepest secrets not in what it has preserved, but in what it has destroyed. The concept of geological time is one that most people find genuinely difficult to internalize, and that is not surprising, because nothing in ordinary human experience prepares us for numbers like 4 billion years. The human brain evolved to deal with time scales of days and seasons and human lifetimes. Historical time scales of thousands of years are already at the outer limit of intuitive comprehension. The geological time scale, with its millions and billions of years, is truly beyond intuition. It can only be grasped through analogy and through deliberate, conscious effort. One analogy that sometimes helps is to compress Earth's history into a single calendar year. If the Earth formed on January 1st of our hypothetical year, then the Akasta Gneiss would have formed around January 20th. The Nuvvuagittuq greenstone belt, if it is as old as the neodymium dating suggests, would have formed around January 10th. The first definitive evidence for life, in whatever form it takes, appears sometime in February or March. The Great Oxidation event occurs around late March. The gunflint microfossils are preserved around early April. The Sudbury impact happens around late April. The assembly of Rodinia occurs in August. The snowball Earth events happen in October and November. The Cambrian explosion occurs on November 17th. The first fish appear in early December. Land, plants, and animals colonize the continents in mid-December. The dinosaurs dominate from December 16th to December 26th. The asteroid that killed them hits on the 26th. The first hominids appear on December 31st, late in the afternoon. All of recorded human history, every civilization, every invention, every war, every great work of art, every scientific discovery, every king and queen and philosopher and saint fits into the last 12 seconds of December 31st. The pyramids of Giza were built about 2 seconds before midnight. You're reading this in the final fraction of a second before the year ends, and through all of that, the rocks of the Canadian Shield have been there. Through the entire year of Earth history, from that early January formation of the Akasta gneiss to this final second of December, the ancient basement of the Canadian Shield has persisted. It has been through everything. It is the oldest witness on Earth. The communities that live and work in the Canadian Shield today are as much a part of its story as the ancient rocks. The First Nations and Inuit communities of northern Canada have a relationship with the Shield that is intimate and practical and spiritual in ways that Western science is only beginning to appreciate. The Cree people of northern Quebec and Ontario have lived in the Shield country for thousands of years, and their knowledge of the land, of its seasonal rhythms, its animal populations, its waterways and portages, represents a kind of accumulated understanding that took generations to develop, and that encodes information about the ecology and geography of the Shield that is not available from any other source. The traditional ecological knowledge of northern Indigenous peoples has become an important resource for biologists, ecologists, and geologists studying the Shield, not as a replacement for scientific investigation, but as a complement to it, a different way of knowing the same landscape. The mining towns of the Canadian Shield, from Timmins to Thompson to Yellowknife, tell another part of the story. These communities were built by the discovery and exploitation of the mineral wealth locked in the ancient rocks. They represent the meeting point between the 4 billion year geological history of the Shield and the much shorter history of industrial civilization. The ore bodies being mined in these towns were created by geological processes that operated billions of years ago in conditions that no longer exist on Earth. The mining operations that extract those ore bodies use the most sophisticated technologies of the 21st century. The intersection of the deepest past and the most contemporary present is constant in these places, and it generates a peculiar kind of historical vertigo that is unique to the Shield. The environmental history of the Shield in the post-industrial era is also part of its story, and not always a flattering one. The roasting of sulfide ores in the smelters of Sudbury for much of the 20th century produced sulfur dioxide emissions that devastated the boreal ecosystem around the city. The lakes and forests within a radius of many kilometers from the Sudbury smelters were severely damaged by acid rain. The landscape around the smelters became barren and alien, the red rock bare of vegetation, the lakes acidified and fishless. It was an ecological catastrophe, and it was a warning about the capacity of industrial activity to damage ecosystems even at the local scale. The subsequent environmental recovery of the Sudbury region, driven by the greening program that began in the 1970s and continued for decades, is now held up as one of the great environmental success stories in North American history. Millions of trees have been replanted. The lakes have recovered. Fish have returned. The landscape, though still marked by the scale of past mining, has been substantially rehabilitated. The ancient rocks of the shield survived Sudbury's industrial period as they have survived everything else. But the life that depended on them required a different kind of resilience. The future of the Canadian Shield, in the context of climate change, raises profound questions. The boreal forest that covers much of the Shield is one of the largest terrestrial carbon stores on Earth. The peatlands of the Hudson Bay lowlands contain enormous quantities of ancient organic carbon that has been accumulating in the cold, wet climate of the Shield for thousands of years since the last glaciation. As the climate warms, the permafrost that underlies these peatlands is thawing. Thawing permafrost releases carbon dioxide and methane, greenhouse gases that contribute further to warming. The feedback loop is well established and deeply concerning. The Shield, which has been sequestering carbon in its peatlands for 10,000 years, may become a carbon source rather than a carbon sink within the coming decades, with consequences for the global climate that extend far beyond Canada. The warming climate is also changing the ecology of the Shield in other ways. Species ranges are shifting northward. The boreal forest is changing in composition as warmer adapted species move north. The ice cover on Shield lakes and rivers is diminishing, with consequences for the winter travel routes used by Indigenous communities and for the aquatic ecosystems that have adapted to those ice regimes. Invasive species, previously limited by cold winters, are now penetrating further into the Shield. The ancient landscape is not impervious to contemporary change. 4 billion years of geological stability does not mean ecological immunity to the kind of rapid, anthropogenic climate change that is happening now. And yet the rocks themselves, those 4 billion-year-old witnesses, will endure. They have seen ice ages come and go, greenhouse climates and glacial climates, and everything in between. They have survived impacts that would have been considered extinction-level events by any standard. They have watched life evolve from the first uncertain chemical steps to the extraordinarily complex biosphere that exists today. Whatever happens in the coming centuries and millennia, the Akasta gneiss will be there. The Nuvvuagittuq greenstone will be there. The gunflint chert with its billion-year-old microfossils will be there. The banded iron formations, the Diamondiferous kimberlite pipes, the ancient dike swarms, the glacially sculpted lakes and valleys, all of it will be there. Long after any concern we might have about climate or politics or the fate of our civilization has been resolved one way or another, the Canadian Shield will endure. Recording whatever happens next, adding new pages to its 4 billion-year geological autobiography. The scientists who study the Canadian Shield are, in a very real sense, reading a message that the Earth wrote to itself over billions of years. The rocks are the medium. The minerals are the words. The chemical compositions and isotopic ratios and crystal structures are the grammar. And the message, when read with sufficient skill and patience, is the history of this planet from its earliest moments to the present day. Every field expedition to the Shield, every sample collected and dated and analyzed, every geophysical survey and every drill core is an act of translation. We are learning to read a language that was written before we existed, in a script that takes decades to master, describing events that happened before any living thing had eyes to see or brain to comprehend. That translation project is one of the great ongoing intellectual adventures of our time. It involves geologists and geochemists and paleontologists and microbiologists and planetary scientists and isotope specialists and structural geologists and geophysicists. It uses equipment ranging from hand lenses and rock hammers to synchrotron X-ray sources and mass spectrometers sensitive enough to measure isotope ratios in individual mineral grains. It requires field work in some of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth and laboratory work of extraordinary technical precision, and it is producing, incrementally, a picture of the early Earth that is more detailed and more surprising than anyone who worked on it a generation ago could have imagined. The discoveries are not just scientifically significant, they are humanly significant. Understanding the early Earth, understanding the origin and early evolution of life, understanding the processes that created the mineral resources and the landscapes and the ecosystems that support human civilization, is understanding ourselves and our place in a very old and very complex story. The Canadian Shield is not just a geological feature, it is our deepest connection to the history of this planet. It is the oldest chapter of the book we live in, and it is still being written, still being read, still yielding its secrets to those who come to it with curiosity and patience and the right tools. There is a lake in the Northwest Territories, not far from the Acasta River, that has no name on any map. It sits in a shallow depression in the ancient granite, its water clear and cold, its shores covered with black spruce and Labrador tea. Caribou come to drink from it in the fall. Loons nest on its islands in the summer. In the winter it freezes solid, and the ice groans and cracks in the cold. It is, in every surface appearance, just another lake in the boreal wilderness. But the rock beneath it is 4 billion years old. The water that fills it fell as rain and flowed from melting snow into crevices in that ancient rock, and some of it seeped down into the deep fractures where the ancient formation water has been sealed for 1 billion years. The fish in the lake are descendants of fish that colonized the shield lakes as the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago. The spruce trees on its shores are growing from soils that formed in the last few thousand years as organic matter accumulated on rock that was there when the solar system was young. Standing at the shore of that lake, if you knew the story of the rock beneath your feet, you would be standing at the intersection of every time scale that the Earth operates on. The 4 billion year time scale of the rock's formation, the billion-year timescale of the ancient water in the deep fractures, the 100 million year timescale of the diamonds in the kimberlite pipes. Not far away, the tens of millions of years timescale of the erosion that brought the deep rock to the surface, the 10,000 year timescale of the post-glacial landscape, the 100-year timescale of the oldest trees on the shore, the single-year timescale of the loon's nesting season, the day's timescale of the light on the water. All of those timescales, from the incomprehensibly ancient to the immediately present, meeting at the shore of a nameless lake in the Northwest Territories. All of them inscribed in the same ancient landscape. All of them part of the same unbroken story. That is what the Canadian Shield is. It is not just a geological formation. It is not just a collection of old rocks. It is a place where all of Earth's time is simultaneously present, where the deepest past and the immediate present exist side by side in the same landscape, available to anyone who comes to it with eyes open and the willingness to look. It is the oldest place in North America and one of the oldest places on Earth. It is buried, literally, beneath much of Canada, beneath the cities and farms and forests that most Canadians think of as the real country. But it is also exposed literally in thousands of rock outcrops and lake shores and road cuts and mine faces, waiting for anyone who wants to touch the ancient earth and feel the weight of 4 billion years in the palm of their hand. That is the invitation the Canadian Shield extends to anyone willing to accept it. Come and see. Come and look at the oldest rocks on this planet. Come and stand on the ancient basement of a continent and let the scale of time wash over you. Come and understand, really understand, what it means to live on a planet that is 4.5 billion years old and that has been changing and transforming and rebuilding itself for every one of those billions of years. Come and see the evidence of the first life, the first oxygen, the first complex cells, the first multicellular organisms. Come and see the scars of ancient impacts and the roots of ancient mountains. Come and hold a piece of the deep earth brought to the surface by an ancient diamond pipe, and know that you are holding something that formed 150 kilometers underground in the mantle of the earth, hundreds of millions of years before the first dinosaur ever walked the land. The Canadian Shield is the oldest story on earth. It is a story of unimaginable antiquity, extraordinary endurance, and constant slow revelation. It is a story that is still being told, still being discovered, still surprising us with what it contains. And it is buried right there, beneath the surface of Canada, older than the pyramids, older than civilization, older than complex life, older than almost everything. All you have to do is know where to look. The geology of the Canadian Shield is inseparable from the water that covers so much of it. The Shield has been called a land of 100,000 lakes, though the actual number is far higher. There are more lakes in the Canadian Shield than in any other equivalent area on Earth. They are the legacy of the Laurentide ice sheet, which carved basins into the rock, and then, as it melted, filled them with meltwater. The lakes of the Shield range from enormous bodies, like Lake Superior and Lake Huron, to tiny, nameless ponds barely large enough to float a canoe. But they all share the same essential character: clear, cold, underlain by ancient rock, their water chemistry shaped by the minerals in the granites and gneisses and greenstones beneath them. The chemistry of shield lakes reflects the chemistry of the rocks they are carved into. The ancient crystalline basement of the shield is resistant to chemical weathering and does not easily release minerals to the water. As a result, shield lakes are typically low in dissolved minerals, soft water lakes with few nutrients and limited biological productivity. The water is clear because there is little suspended sediment and few algae. The clarity can be extraordinary. Visibility depths of 10 meters or more are not uncommon in deep shield lakes. This clarity is one of the most visually striking features of the shield landscape, and it is a direct consequence of the geological character of the ancient basement rock. The watershed systems of the Canadian Shield are among the largest in the world. The Shield drains northward to Hudson Bay and the Arctic Ocean, westward to the Arctic through the Mackenzie River system, eastward to the Atlantic through the St. Lawrence, and southward to the Gulf of Mexico through the Great Lakes and the Mississippi system. These drainage systems are superimposed on the ancient geology of the Shield, their courses often controlled by fractures and fault zones in the basement rock, by the differential resistance of different rock types to erosion, and by the pathways carved by ancient glacial meltwater. Many of the major rivers of the Shield follow the same courses that were established when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, their valleys carved by floods of meltwater, so enormous that they beggar the imagination. The rivers of the Shield are also highways of history. They were the routes by which indigenous peoples traveled across the vast interior of the continent, using canoes to navigate the interconnected lake and river systems of the Shield. The birch bark canoe, one of the greatest technological innovations in North American history, was specifically designed for shield travel. Lightweight enough to portage around rapids and over divides, tough enough to survive the rocky shores of shield lakes, maneuverable enough to navigate the swift rivers and narrow channels of the boreal waterscape. The knowledge of the Shield's waterways, accumulated over thousands of years by the peoples who depended on them, represents a form of geographical and ecological understanding that was essential to survival in the Shield environment. When European fur traders arrived in the Shield country in the 17th and 18th centuries, they immediately recognized the value of this indigenous geographical knowledge. the great canoe routes of the fur trade era, including the route of the Northwest Company. Voyageurs from Montreal to the Athabasca country followed paths that had been traveled by indigenous peoples for millennia. The Shield's rivers and lakes were not just geographical features, they were infrastructure, the transportation network of a continent, built by nature and mapped by indigenous knowledge over thousands of years. The Shield country also shaped the character of Canadian culture and identity in ways that are still being explored and articulated. The group of 7, the Canadian painters, who in the early 20th century defined a distinctively Canadian artistic vision, were deeply influenced by the Shield landscape. Tom Thomson, Lauren Harris, A.Y. Jackson, and their colleagues spent extended periods painting in the Shield country of northern Ontario, attracted by its austere beauty, its dramatic light, and the sense of immensity and antiquity it conveyed. Their paintings, with their bold colors and expressive brushwork, captured something essential about the Shield landscape: the way the ancient rock imposes itself on the viewer, the way the vast distances and the spare vegetation create a sense of being in the presence of something very old and very serious. The Shield became, through their art, a symbol of Canadian identity, a landscape that was seen as distinctively and authentically Canadian precisely because it was so different from the European landscapes that dominated the cultural imagination of the colonial era. The scientific investigation of the Shield has its own heroes and its own dramatic stories. The geologists who first mapped the remote Shield country endured conditions that would be familiar to polar explorers. Multi-week canoe expeditions in the pre-Flyin era required the transport of all food and equipment by canoe and portage through country that was sometimes impassable, always demanding, and occasionally actively hostile. Black flies and mosquitoes in the boreal summer are legendary in their ferocity. The weather can change from warm and sunny to cold and stormy within hours. Rivers that appear benign can become dangerous in high water, and the country is so vast and the features so repetitive to the untrained eye that navigation without GPS or reliable maps was a genuine challenge. Those early mapping expeditions and the generations of geological fieldwork that followed produced the foundation of knowledge on which modern Shield geology rests. The geologic maps, rock collections, drill cores, and field notes accumulated over more than a century and a half by the Geological Survey of Canada and its provincial and university equivalents represent an incomparable archive of information about one of the most extraordinary geological features on Earth. That archive is being augmented constantly by new work, new expeditions, new analyses. The story of the Canadian Shield is still being written by scientists working in laboratories and by field geologists still loading canoes at remote fly-in camps, still walking out across the ancient rock to collect the next sample, measure the next outcrop, date the next crystal. In the end, what the Canadian Shield asks of us is simply attention. Attention to the ancient, to the patient, to the enduring. We live in a culture that values speed and novelty and immediate gratification. The Shield offers none of those things. It offers instead depth and antiquity and the humbling recognition that the world was here long before us and will be here long after us, and that the brief moment of human history, for all its noise and drama, is a very small chapter in a very long book. The rocks of the Canadian Shield were 4 billion years old before the first human being ever walked the earth. They will be 4 billion and some millions of years old, long after the last human being is gone. They do not care about our politics or our economies or our ambitions. They simply endure, holding the memory of a world we can only glimpse through the most careful and patient and ingenious investigation. But the investigation is worth it. Every age revealed, every fossil found, every ancient ocean reconstructed, every billion-year-old chemical process decoded, adds to our understanding of the planet we live on and of the life that it supports. The Canadian Shield is not just ancient history. It is the foundation of the present. The oxygen we breathe was first produced by cyanobacteria, whose fossils are preserved in the shield. The iron in our blood came ultimately from banded iron formations like those of the shield. The minerals that make our technology possible, the nickel and copper and gold and diamonds, came from the ancient rocks of the shield. The water that fills our largest lakes, the Great Lakes, sits in basins carved from the shield. We are, in a very real sense, the products of the processes that the Canadian Shield has been recording for 4 billion years. Its story is our story, its age is our heritage, and its secrets, still being revealed, still being discovered, still waiting in the ancient rock, are our invitation to keep looking, keep asking, keep wondering at the extraordinary age and complexity and richness of the world we are lucky enough to inhabit. Something ancient is buried beneath the Canadian Shield, and now, perhaps, you understand just how ancient, and just how much it matters, and just why, when you stand on that bare, ancient rock at the edge of a nameless northern lake, and look out across the water and the forest and the sky, there is a feeling that goes beyond words, a feeling of age, of depth, of something that has been here since almost the beginning, watching, enduring, waiting. The feeling is not an illusion, it is a recognition. The oldest thing you will ever touch is there beneath your feet, and it has a story to tell. All you have to do is listen. The shield does not ask for our reverence. It does not require our acknowledgement. It existed before any living thing had the capacity for reverence or acknowledgement, and it will exist long after that capacity has vanished from this planet. But giving it our attention, taking the time to understand what it is, and what it preserves, and what it means, is one of the most genuinely enriching things any curious person can do. Because in understanding the Canadian Shield, you understand the Earth, you understand time, you understand life, you understand where you came from, in the deepest possible sense of that question. You understand that 4 billion years of planetary history has been moving toward this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this thought. The ancient rock beneath Canada is not just geology, it is context, and context is everything.